Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. Today's conversation is one I've been looking forward to, and one we need now more than ever. I'm joined by Yossi Klein Halevi, someone who I believe is one of the most thoughtful, eloquent, and clear-eyed voices on Israel and its place in the Jewish world, the Middle East, and beyond. Yossi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where he co-directs the Muslim Leadership Initiative. He's the author of the best-selling Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, a book that dares to imagine a different kind of dialogue in this region of deep, entrenched pain. His earlier work, Like Dreamers, traces the stories of Israeli paratroopers, the Tzanchanim, who helped reunify Jerusalem in 1967 and then found themselves on opposite sides of a nation's identity crisis, a crisis we continue to grapple with so many years later. In this episode, we're confronting the painful and perplexing truth. How is it that Israel, a nation that was so divided on October 6, could come together in an unprecedented display of unity on October 7, and yet finds itself just months later sliding back into those old fault lines and old divisions? What changed? What didn't? And what can be still salvaged from that moment of unity? Yossi brings not only analysis, but a moral seriousness to these questions. Let's dive right in. Yossi Klein Halevi, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's great to have you.
Well, I'm thrilled to be with you. I'm a big fan, Yaakov, I have to tell you.
As am I, so I genuinely appreciate it. Yossi, I'm going to jump straight into it because I'm slightly depressed lately when I look at what's happening here in Israel. And slightly, just a bit. And I mean, there was this kind of moment, right? I was speaking today, for example, with someone about where we were on October 6th, how divided, polarized, fractured. October 7th comes and a terrible, of course, unbelievable disaster and massacre, but brought Israel together. And we saw amazing unity. But now here we are 18 months, and this didn't just start yesterday, but we're almost back to exactly where we were on the eve of October 7th. So my basic question to you would be, how did we go from divided to united back to being divided again?
My only quibble with the way you've described the situation is that we're almost back to October 6th. I think in some ways it's worse. Because on October 6th, we didn't know the consequences. There were warnings. The security establishment repeatedly warned Netanyahu that if he continues to pursue the assault on the judiciary, it will lead to war. It will lead to disastrous consequences. So he was warned, but we didn't know the extent of it. We didn't know that we were heading into the abyss. Now we know. Now we're there. And for the government to be repeating exactly what it tried to do on October 6th and wasn't able to, and to do it now when we need unity more than anything else, to me, it's a crime against the state of Israel. It's a historic crime. And, there's this sense that I have of a government that has no brakes, no sense of national responsibility. Now, you asked how did we get to this point? And the truth is that there is one issue that legitimately divides this country, even in times of war, and that we have no choice but to argue out, and that's the fate of the hostages. And there are two legitimate positions about the fate of the hostages. There's the position that says, above all else, we have to bring our people home. And there's the position that says, above all else, we have to bring the regime that did October 7th to the Jewish people, bring them down. Now, these are two very deep expressions of the Israeli ethos. The first is we take care of each other. We don't leave anyone on the battlefield. And that's of course, that's a position of the hostage families. And as it turns out, of about 70% of the Israeli public, that you prioritize the hostages over everything. But the government has a case. There's an argument to be made, and many of us felt that way for months. And that was my position, is that no matter what, we have to bring the first order of business is bring the regime of October 7th down. But a year and a half later, I feel that whatever we've done to Hamas, whatever more we can do to Hamas, doesn't justify letting our hostages die. So, and I think a strong majority of Israelis have come to that position. But my point is that there is a legitimate argument that divides us, and there's an illegitimate argument, and that illegitimate argument is the future of the judiciary. Now, there are two positions on whether we have an aggressive Supreme Court, whether the court has to be reined in. I'm not interested in having that argument now. Not while not while the hostages are dying, not while we're calling up reservists for round God knows how many more months of fighting. How does a Zionist government, and I'm not sure this is a Zionist government, but a government of national responsibility, a government that speaks in the name of patriotism, how do you go back to October 6th and expect us to continue fighting as if it's October 8th? October 6th and October 8th don't go together. And that's what this government is doing to us.
I've heard you refer to the government as the ultra government, right? The ultra orthodox, ultra nationalist. It's like
ultra corrupt.
Ultra corrupt. And it's pretty remarkable when you think about the fact that 18 months later, after the greatest disaster to the state of Israel, the day when the most Jews were murdered on a single day since the Holocaust, the fact that hostages are still languishing in captivity in Gaza 18 months later, and it's still the same people. And we're passing another budget, and we're giving billions of shekels more to these political partners of Netanyahu who don't carry the national burden. I mean, to me, it's almost also, how do we not see the streets packed on a daily basis here? And I think because it's a frustration that, we could argue, is Netanyahu to blame? Is he not to blame? Should they have woken him up in the middle of the night? Should they have not woken him up? But you can't ignore the fact that it's almost, for some people and those who sit in the Knesset, nothing's really changed.
Yeah. Well, in terms of Netanyahu's responsibility, it has nothing to do with the events that he played a role in on October 7th. It has to do with the year leading up to October 7th, when, as I said a moment ago, he was repeatedly warned by the security establishment, and he refused to meet with the chief of staff. I don't know if there was another instance in the history of the state where the chief of staff asked for an urgent meeting and the prime minister turned them down for political reasons. And so and of course, not to mention Netanyahu's responsibility for funding Hamas for years. So the question of whether he should have been woken up or not is a technicality.
Yeah.
Netanyahu's responsibility, Netanyahu's guilt is so deeply embedded in the events leading up to October 7th. Now, Yaakov, you were asking about why aren't the streets erupting? I mean, to some extent, they are erupting, not enough. If you look at what's happening in Istanbul, look at what's happened in Serbia. I mean, the millions of people pouring into the streets. You would think that something similar would happen here, especially given the enormity of what we've experienced. And maybe one answer is psychological, and it has to do with precisely the enormity of what we've experienced. I think we're still a society in shock. And I think this shock expresses itself for each of us individually. I know for me, I'm completely unmoored in time. Since October 7th, I literally never know what day it is. And often I forget what month it is. And I think it expresses itself in different ways for different people, but collectively, we're also a society that has just taken one too many blows. And initially, I thought, just wait for the reservists to come back from the front. And they're going to do what the reservists did after the Yom Kippur War. And as soon as they were demobilized, the first thing they did was go to the prime minister's office and camp out and refuse to move. And they brought Prime Minister Golda Meir down and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, neither of whom intended to resign. But the outraged reservists, many of them, by the way, most of them came from the Labor Party. It was a revolt from within. And so one question that I have to the right...
By the way, I'll just add, you saw that in 2006, after the Second Lebanon War. Similarly, reservists came back, and that's what led to the Commission of Inquiry that Olmert had to establish, the Winograd Commission.
Right. So my question to the right is, where are you now? How can you allow this government to stain your camp, to so profoundly compromise your camp? But I wonder whether the fact that we're still shell-shocked in some way is overwhelming us and making it so difficult for Israeli society as a whole to act more effectively. And I really, and maybe it also has to do with the fact that the reservists haven't really been demobilized.
Right.
After the Yom Kippur War, okay, so they served an additional 3, 4, 5 months at the front, but when they were demobilized, the war was over. That's not the case here. So it's still open-ended. There are many Israelis, understandably, though I think they're wrong, who feel that we should not be demonstrating against the government in a time of war, or you don't switch the prime minister. Now, Neville Chamberlain was forced to resign in the middle of World War II, and Churchill was brought in. So in that sense, I think that we have a very useful precedent. And without going into the question of whether Netanyahu is or isn't Chamberlain, I personally think that Chamberlain is a more honorable leader, because he really thought he was doing the best for England, and I wish I could say the same about Netanyahu.
I'll tell you a conversation I had recently with a friend who's an officer in the reserves, and we were talking about the Haredi draft, and of course, everyone, you can't not but be frustrated and disappointed with what's happening there, the failure to enlist. And I said, but you know what? To some extent, you're to blame, because you keep on, when they call you up, you keep on coming, right? If, for example, not that I'm advocating, but if, for example, hypothetically speaking, a great number of reservists were to say, listen, until there's a draft law, until the Haredim get their draft orders, we're not going to keep serving in these numbers because it's ridiculous that we keep on getting called up. But I think that maybe this is why it's the forever war for Netanyahu, to borrow Joe Biden's phrase, is that it's about keeping them mobilized, like you said, Yossi, so that they won't be able to protest. Maybe that's part of his calculation.
Maybe it is, but the precedent of using reserve service to achieve political goals was a disaster, and I'm talking, of course, about the movement to save Israeli democracy. My movement, which adopted a disastrous policy of linking service to the judicial assault, and I continue to place primary blame on the government, where I believe it belongs, but my camp can't be fully absolved from responsibility for October 7th either. And I think that what we need after October 7th is a great cheshbon nefesh, a self-reckoning in Israeli society, where each camp needs to look at itself and say, what did we do to bring this disaster on us, and how do we start backing away? Now, here we are in stage 2 of this unfolding tragedy. where again the government is this is a government of October 6th. This is a government that feeds off of schism, that needs division in Israeli society to activate its base. It's a government that thrives off of hatred for your fellow Jew. And for that reason alone, Netanyahu should be put on trial. But what we need really to do, Yaakov, is take the whole question of military service out of political calculations, no matter how justified. And the scenario you're laying out, part of me wishes it would happen, but it's a disaster, and we can't go there. The problem, though, is that the cheshbon nefesh tends to happen on one side of the equation.
No.
And Netanyahu's supporters are, you know, what me worry? Remember Alfred E. Newman in Mad Magazine? What me to blame for anything?
No, as I heard Miri Regev the other day explain, there's a difference between responsibility and blame. We collectively as the government are responsible, but we're not to blame. And I'm thinking, what is she talking about? I do not know what that means.
They're not to blame. And can you imagine if Bennett or Lapid had been prime minister on October 7th?
Yeah.
What the right would have done to them? We don't even need to speculate. We have Netanyahu's clips from, you mentioned the Second Lebanon War. Netanyahu's clips in 2006 with this tremendous righteous rage against Olmert. How dare he evade responsibility? He's the prime minister. He's responsible. And Netanyahu, of course, was right.
By the way, not to mention that Netanyahu at the same time, when Olmert was only under police investigation, said that you can't remain prime minister. And look where we are with Netanyahu now, deep into his trial. But Yossi, the country where we are at the moment, though, with this division and still needing to fight a war and fighting it, I would say, with some measure of success, at least on the battlefield, right? There's no question that these soldiers are heroes, the likes of, I was thinking back to your book, Like Dreamers, and those characters that you wrote there. There could be a new book today, multiple, endless number of books.
Hopefully there will be. And in some ways, they're actually a greater generation than 67 and 73, because this is the first time that Israelis went to war without any faith in the decency of our leaders. Whenever we went to war, we always criticized our leaders. In 67, Levi Eshkol, the prime minister at the time, was wrongly, I think, perceived as wishy-washy. He delivered our greatest victory. Golda, of course, was hounded out of office because of the Yom Kippur War. In 1982, Menachem Begin essentially was forced to resign because of the failures of the Lebanon War. But we always, even though we felt that our leaders were inadequate in time of war, we never questioned their patriotism, their love of Israel. We never questioned the fact that Golda or Begin placed the well-being of the country ahead of their own political interests, especially in war. This is the first time that a majority of Israelis, according to the polls, repeatedly say that the prime minister places his own political interests ahead of the well-being of the country during war. And yet, we continued, we showed up in ways that were no less impressive than 67 and 73. And yet from this place of there's nobody to rely on but ourselves. And the maturity that Israeli society showed on October 8th, the government fell apart. The government couldn't provide the most basic social services, let alone protect the border. And yet people showed up. Everyone knew what they had to do. There was something like 50% of the Israeli public participated in some act of voluntarism after October 7th. There's nothing like that anywhere in the world, by far. And so I believe that October 8th was the moment of the maturation of Israeli society. And so when I look at this generation of young people going off and now going off to fight after 3, 4, 500 days, and they're still going. We've never, not since 1948, have we seen anything like this. And there's one more factor here, which moves me so much about the soldiers today. When we fought in the past, 67 or 73, there was this feeling of that so much of the world was admiring Israel. Now we're Nazis, and yet these kids are showing up, and it is the worst war by far that we have fought, certainly since 1948. The most brutal, the ugliest war, and one of the most necessary. But the fact that these kids know that even though it's the ugliest war we've ever fought, it's also one of the most necessary. That also shows a level of maturity, which frankly just stuns me.
You know, I kind of want to connect some of the dots here, but your book, Lake Dreamers, which is a great read, and talks about how the greatest success also is what created the greatest divide to some extent, with the question of the Palestinians and the question of the West Bank and Gaza and the territories. And I'll jump fast forward to your book afterwards, A Letter to My Palestinian Neighbor, where you try to kind of talk to the need for peace and the need for some sort of plan and a way forward in this impasse that has really existed since the 1967 war. And now, once again, here we are, 18 months into a war with the Palestinians, and without really a way forward. Because even when you talk to people and you go to government, and I go to these offices and I get these briefings and I ask these questions, what's the plan, right? What are we doing? Where is it going? What's the governing entity that's going to come in and take over the Gaza Strip? I get blank faces. I have people who don't know what to say to me. And it seems that we're doing a great job. These heroes who, again, are amazing. It's the generation. It Bar Kokhba pales in comparison to some extent. Totally agree. But for what is all of this being done for?
Look, there's not going to be any change as long as this government is in power. And the irony is that a previous iteration of Netanyahu would have readily come up with a plan that the international community could live with for Gaza, would have almost certainly brought in the Palestinian Authority. He's done it in the past. He's worked with the PA. The PA is not a partner for a peace agreement. The PA does not accept Israel's legitimacy. It doesn't accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state in any borders. But the PA is a proven partner tactically. We can do business with the PA. We can't do business with Hamas. That was Netanyahu's fatal miscalculation. He thought he could do business with Hamas. And so in that situation, you do bring the PA into Gaza, let them run it, let them run the ruins of Gaza together with the Arab world. The Arab world is looking for a pretext to come in to post-war Gaza. And the only fig leaf we can provide would be a PA government. And Netanyahu understands that. But of course he's beholden to the far right, and it's a different Netanyahu. It is a Netanyahu that the old Netanyahu would have denounced, would not have recognized. And I give the old Netanyahu the credit. And he was always deeply flawed, but he was a legitimate leader and a pragmatic leader. And so under this government, with this version of Netanyahu, nothing will change. But and this is something you've written and spoken about, Yaakov, a lot, which is the region is changing, and we can't lose sight of that. The Abraham Accords is an historic turning point.
Yeah.
We are now looking potentially at the end of the Sunni-Israeli conflict. Now, for the last 80 years, The Arab-Israeli conflict was the Sunni-Israeli conflict. And we talked briefly about the Yom Kippur War before. In the immediate aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, Israel faced devastation, economic and diplomatic devastation, because of the Arab oil boycott, which was led by the Saudis and the Gulf states. And today, these are the countries that we have the best chance for normalization with. And so, you live long enough and the wheel turns really 360 degrees. It's extraordinary the potential of this moment. And that has repercussions for the Palestinians as well. I don't think the Palestinians want a two-state solution, certainly not a two-state solution that would leave Israel in a viable state, a two-state solution that would not include massive return of the descendants of refugees to Israel. So there's no negotiations to be had with the Palestinian leadership. But there is very much a possibility of a regional agreement. And this is a regional conflict that requires a regional solution. And a regional solution led by the Saudis could impose some kind of a Palestinian state, maybe a Palestinian state minus, on a Palestinian leadership that is not interested in a two-state solution. And so the notion of seeing no hope on the Palestinian horizon is true if we're focused on the bilateral relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. Will never negotiate a peace agreement. That's the Oslo model is over. But in the context of a regional solution where we have Arab allies, and just think for a moment, I savor that expression, Israel's Arab allies, because we have never, until the Abraham Accords, we never had allies. Egypt was not an ally. Jordan was not an ally. We had glorified ceasefires that were pretending to be peace agreements. But we now have the possibility of normalization with our the most dangerous enemies in the Arab world, the Saudis. And so that's what gives me hope. It's not the Palestinian relationship. It's an indirect relationship with the Arab world, which could change the dynamic in our relationship with the Palestinians.
Assuming that Israel and this government, unless we're saying it all has to wait for another government, but assuming that this government can at least even pay the lip service that's required for the Saudis to be able to even move forward on something like this.
Yaakov, that's the tragedy. If you read between the lines, what the Saudis are telling us is just say it. You used to say it, even you, Netanyahu. You used to speak about a two-state solution. We can't deliver. We can't survive the rage in Saudi society and in the Arab world without this fig leaf. We have to show that there's some movement. Just play along. And again, a previous iteration of Netanyahu would have jumped at it. Peace with the Saudis, the end of the Sunni-Israeli conflict, and all I have to do is repeat my Bar Ilan speech of 2010. That's a no-brainer. But he can't do it because his government will fall, because his far-right partners are not cynics. They're true believers. Yeah. They are honest people. And they really believe that it is in Israel's best interests to go for annexation and forfeit the end of the regional war against us. Now, I think they're insane, but I certainly respect their integrity. Netanyahu is not insane. He understands this, but he has no integrity, and that's our tragedy.
So, Yossi, before I do let you go, and this has been fascinating, as I knew it would be, but also, not most uplifting. So give me something that provides you with optimism today.
Wait a minute. We're talking about...
we're talking about Saudi, but we're saying it's not going to happen.
We're saying it's not going to happen under this
Right,
government.
right.
So the second part of that optimistic scenario is that this government is going to fall in the coming months.
Hmm.
How? I don't know. The Qatar Gate, there'll be the scandal will just it'll finally be one scandal too far for Netanyahu to manage, or the Haredi exemption bill will fail because some Likud cabinet ministers are afraid of facing their children at their Shabbat dinner. You know, uh, there are so many, or the hostage issue will spiral out of control. There are so many ways in which this government can fall. Trump deciding to force Israel to end the war, and Israel's and the coalition's far right parties delivering an ultimatum to Netanyahu. It's us or Trump, and so I look at Netanyahu's options. I see the walls closing in on him, and even the great magician of Israeli politics, even Houdini, can slip up, and I don't know if he can really get out of the this convergence of threats to his government. And worst case scenario, he survives till the end of his term, and then hopefully we bring him down. But sooner or later, this abnormal situation will end. It's inconceivable that the government of October 7th would remain in power indefinitely. It's just not going to happen. And so and you have every poll since October 7th, except the polls of Channel 14, which are,
Can't believe him.
no, that's really in-house propaganda.
Hmm.
But every credible poll has shown a firm majority bringing this government down. So that's and I believe in the common sense of the Israeli public, not only in our capacity to sacrifice, but in our innate wisdom. And we know when we're being taken for a ride. We know that a prime minister who blames everyone but himself for the disaster that he presided over is not a worthy leader for this people. It's not a worthy. He's not a worthy leader of this generation and all the sacrifices that they've made. So sooner or later, something is going to break, and we'll be there to pick up the pieces.
Yossi Klein Halevi, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode. You can find us, as always, where podcasts can be found, on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and of course the website of Times of Israel. Feel free to send me any comments, questions, suggestions. It's yaakovkatz@gmail.com. In the meantime, we'll be back on Thursday with another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast. Stay safe.